Hello everyone, I'm Steve Whitlock, a research scientist at the University of Washington. Thank you for tuning in and allowing me the opportunity to discuss an often overlooked issue in acoustic telemetry studies. The main goal of this talk is to get people to think more about the problem of predators consuming tags in acoustic study and how that affects the inferences that are drawn. I'd like to first acknowledge my co-author and co-lead of the Columbia Basin Research Unit, Dr. Rebecca Buchanan. Rebecca's the one that conceived of this project after a lot of time and effort considering the problem. As I'm sure everyone here knows, acoustic telemetry is a powerful tool for fisheries research. At small spatial scales, it provides 2- and 3-dimensional tracking capabilities, and at larger scales, these tags have especially high detection probability at interrogation sites compared to passive tags. Over the years, these tags have gotten smaller and more efficient, and as a result, researchers are designing studies that ask more and more of this technology. But I'm the kind of person that likes to remind people about assumptions. The kind of assumptions we hear about most frequently with tagging studies are those related to how tagging might affect the behavior or mortality of the tag study subject. However, there's another implicit assumption that tags are genuine, meaning that they do not reflect the behavior of a predator that has actually consumed a tag study subject. In our experience, this is something that can be easily overlooked and is often dealt with in an informal and ad hoc manner. Anytime a predator consumes a study subject, there's an opportunity for bias to creep in. This affects estimates of habitat use, travel time, survival, and is something we refer to as the tag predation problem. Though this issue extends to marine mammals and terrestrial predators, we're here going to focus on piscivorous fish, which are the most problematic in these studies. The severity of this bias depends on a few interrelated factors. First is predation risk. With large study subjects, tag consumption isn't really something that you're going to need to worry about especially. Second comes the study design and objectives. A worst case scenario would be studying the behavior of a population by tracking a species that is vulnerable to predation and that you're only looking at over a really short time frame. But if you're studying the survival of juvenile salmon or steelhead as they outmigrate past a gauntlet of predators, then tag predation may not really matter because the spatial scale of individual migration far exceeds the home range of any given predator. The prevalence of this issue has led to many different methods for flagging and removing suspicious tags or detections prior to analysis, all of which rely on there being a contrast in the behavior of the study subjects and their predators. Ideally, the rules or methods for filtering tags should be established a priori, although that's often not the case. Here we define any formalized rule set, statistical procedure, or algorithm used to identify whether a tagged subject was predated as a predator filter. Now, there are a few forms that predator filters take. So there are rule-based filters that use predefined thresholds to define the capabilities and expected behavior of the study subject. There are also pattern recognition approaches that let the data indicate observations that represent outliers or some sort of significant departure from what's expected. In essence, rule-based filters seek to identify suspicious records by looking for behaviors that are impossible or unrealistic for the study subject, and these can be defined by expert judgment or by past research. And though these rules can seem simple at first, they can also encompass a broad range of complexity. For example, it could just be a dichotomous key like the one shown here, or there could be spatially explicit rules or sort of special cases that are considered, and then in that case the number of rules really stacks up. Pattern recognition filters use automated procedures to identify outliers or clusters of aberrant detections and exclude those. The term pattern recognition is a broad umbrella that includes statistics and machine learning techniques. The most common method is to use a cluster analysis to group tags based on characteristics of individual clusters, and these assignments are usually made at the tag level. Because rule-based and pattern recognition filters work differently, they also imply different trade-offs, but there hasn't been a lot of work looking at comparing the approaches directly. For this study, our main research questions were: how do different types of filters compare with each other? And ultimately, how do those differences affect inferences that are drawn? We compared multiple filter types using a case study. This was just 1 year of more than a decade of work on identifying sources and magnitude of mortality for this imperiled species. And survival was pretty dismal in the year we chose. The fish, which we refer to as smolts, were tagged and released in the San Joaquin River, and their movement and survival was monitored using a series of arrays. The final survival analysis used a Cormac jelly zebra model, but we were also interested in estimating the travel time downstream. Here's a map of the study area with stations labeled, and you don't need to pay attention to any of the specific site names. There's also some gauging stations throughout. The fish are released at Durham Ferry in the bottom right, and then they follow the river down into the estuary. And there's a chance that a small number of fish can take a left turn and go down this old river route, but there was a barrier in that year, so don't worry about it. Here are labels for some of the important landmarks. These landmarks also kind of divide the reaches into some distinct habitat types. So up in this green section in the upper river, it's more meandering and riverine. The farther down you go, the more tidal influence comes into play. You can't hope to distinguish predated tags without some metrics to draw on, and these break out into two categories. There's behavioral metrics derived from the detection history, things like the average rate of travel or the time where they resided near a particular station. And there's also habitat data that gives you a sense of the tidal influence and the downstream flow. Very quickly here, I'm going to talk about the different flavors of filters that we compared, beginning with the two rule-based ones. So the simple rule-based filter consisted of 5 rules, and a tag that was flagged for any single violation was removed immediately. The complex rule-based filter, on the other hand, had a lot more rules and was spatially explicit, but there was also more leeway in terms of the number of violations that we allowed. As for the pattern recognition side of things, we compiled a data set of 20 metrics and used hierarchical cluster analysis, along with some ordination to assist in interpretation. First, we did a straightforward cluster analysis and used standard methods for determining an optimal number of clusters to interpret, and this is what we called our smolt-only filter. We also did cluster analysis where we included a data set of known tagged predators that were swimming around the study area at the same time, and then used those to help differentiate or determine a good number of clusters. I don't have much time to get into it, but we also pioneered an approach for extracting detection level results by recursively performing an ordination analysis and excluding observations that went outside of an ellipse that characterize kind of sort of normal tag behavior versus deviant tag behavior. I'm going to jump straight into results, beginning with the pattern recognition filters. It's just a little bit easier to explain those first and then show you how the rules panned out alongside of them. So on the right is a cluster analysis dendrogram for the multi-species version of the pattern recognition filter. And the bars to the left have little black slices representing predator classifications. And then all the gray areas are smolts that were just used normally in the analysis. And then the colors, so like the green, purple, blue, yellow, all correspond to different known tag predator species. So of the 618 tags in the study, 66 were picked up by the smolt-only filtering approach, down here on the bottom, and 89 by the approach that used the known tag predators as sentinels. You also notice that all the tags picked up by the smolt-only filter were also picked up by the multi-species filter. And what happened here was that I had virtually the same clustering occur, but when you just use the standard procedures for cluster analysis and determining an optimal number, only 2 groupings came out, when really there were actually 3 significant groupings that describe predator-like behavior, or I guess 2 for predators and then 1 for the smolts. So this is a principal component ordination plot of the multi-species analysis, and this is just another way to represent the broad patterns of the same cluster analysis. So at the center you see a concentration of gray points, and that's all the tags that were classified as smolts. And then you see that up and to the right and then downward in those directions basically reflects tag histories with a lot of upstream movement or with a lot of resident behavior. And then all the colored points symbolize the different predator species that were tagged. So you can kind of see that that's like 2 different ways or two different expressions of behavior are being captured and used to distinguish normal smolts. So now I'm going to overlay the results of the 2 rule-based filters kind of alongside this pattern recognition analysis that I hope I've explained clearly. And what we see here is that although there's some overlap, especially at the very top and very bottom of the plot in terms of which tags were considered suspicious, there's a lot of suspicious tags in the middle of the rule-based analysis that, according to the pattern recognition filters, were perfectly fine. So that was a pretty noticeable difference there. Also, notice that the complex rule-based filter ruled out a total of 139 different individuals, which was more than any of the other filters present. And the simple rule-based filter was actually along the same lines as the multi-species filter in terms of the number of tags that were found to be suspicious. So far we've really just talked about the differences between the two filters and which tags they found suspicious, but where the rubber really hits the road is in comparing how applying different filters affects the survival estimates. So I've glossed over all of those analysis methods, but here are the final cumulative survival estimates for each of the 4 filters. And note that the y-axis scale is a little shifted because survival was so dismal in this particular year. And you notice that at the very end, at A20 and T1 site, that there's a lot of overlap, so that it doesn't appear that the choice of filter made too much of a difference all the way to the end. There's a little bit of differentiation around 40 to 50 kilometers between the performance of the pattern recognition and the rule-based filter. It seems as though the complex and simple rule-based filters were excluding more tags in that intermediate spot, but then ultimately there was so much mortality that it came out the same in the end. Moving on to the analysis of the travel time data, notice that there was actually a pretty large difference in the maximum estimated travel time between the pattern recognition filter and then the simple and complex rule-based filter. We also included the unfiltered data in this comparison just to see. In terms of evaluating this specific behavioral attribute, it appears that the choice of pattern recognition filter really played a much larger role specifically for that maximum travel time estimate. Not so much early on in the... So as for our main conclusions, in terms of comparing just the differences between the different filters and which tags they pulled out, it seems like the complex rule-based filters flag the most tags, and it just kind of stands to reason that the more rules and especially the more spatially explicit limitations that are placed on these filters, the more things you're going to pick up. And depending on the context of the study, that can be something that's really important to have or to be really conservative about. Another thing that we noticed was that there was a lot greater variability between the different filter types, rule-based and pattern recognition, than within. As far as the effect of predator filter on inference, in our case study, we really didn't see that large of a system-wide effect for survival in this case. There's some other years that have higher survival, or there might have been more of an opportunity to see those differences, but they just didn't really come out in this case. We did have a much more dramatic difference in the estimated maximum travel time, which has some implications in terms of the acoustic tag life, but overall it was pretty minimal. And I think an important conclusion of this is that if the choice of predator filter isn't having a lot of leverage on the analysis, maybe opting for a more simple method might be better. Some additional recommendations we have also are that the ordination in conjunction with the cluster analysis was a helpful tool to make sure that these clusters weren't arbitrarily dividing up the data. And if we didn't have the known tag predators in the mix, it would have been really difficult to discern exactly why some of these individuals were outliers or appeared to form their own new clusters. This work isn't over by any means, and we actually recently received funding for a proposal to investigate these methods further and maybe look into a hybrid approach where we can explicitly apply those rules to tags at the same time that we're using the ordination to let the data tell us what's going on. So it'd be kind of a best of both worlds situation. Now, this work wouldn't have been possible without the support in terms of data and effort from a lot of different agencies and folks, specifically Chris Holbrook from USGS. We'd also like to acknowledge funding for the tagging study and analysis by CVPIA, CDWR, USBR. Also, I'd like to thank the Bureau of Rec, Fish and Wildlife Service, and USGS for the data. Thank you all for tuning in person and remotely, but I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.